The hospital I work at had seen better days. Built in the 1950s, the building was showing its age: cracked tiles, flickering fluorescent lights, and that peculiar smell hospitals tend to have, a mix of antiseptic and something older, more ingrained. Despite its worn appearance, the hospital was still operational, and I'd been working there as a nurse for nearly 3 years. There was one room, though, that everyone on the night shift avoided: room 319. It was tucked away at the end of a long, narrow hallway on the 3rd floor, almost forgotten. Officially, it was used for storage, but there were whispers that something far more unsettling had happened there. The story goes that, about 15 years ago, a patient had died in that room under strange circumstances. A woman in her late 60s, admitted for a routine procedure, had suffered a sudden cardiac arrest in the middle of the night. The details were murky, but it was said that she'd been found sitting upright in her bed, her eyes wide open, staring at something unseen. The nurse on duty claimed the room had been unbearably cold when she found the woman, and that a feeling of dread had washed over her the moment she entered. After that night, the room was closed off and eventually repurposed for storage. I'd never given much thought to the rumors, until the night I was assigned to do inventory on the 3rd floor. The hospital was understaffed, as usual, and I was asked to clear out some old equipment and supplies from room 319 to make space for new arrivals. It was late, just after 11 p.m., when I made my way to the 3rd floor, the corridors eerily silent, the kind of quiet that makes your skin prickle. When I reached room 319, I hesitated. The door was old, the paint chipped and peeling. The brass numbers had tarnished to a dull green, barely legible. Taking a deep breath, I unlocked the door and pushed it open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the hallway behind me. As I stepped inside, the air immediately felt different, thicker, colder. I fumbled for the light switch, and when the fluorescent lights flickered on, I saw the room was filled with old hospital beds, stands, and boxes of unused medical supplies, all covered in a thin layer of dust. As I began to sort through the items, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The room was quiet, but it wasn't the usual stillness of an empty space. It felt like something was watching me, waiting. I tried to brush it off, focusing on the task at hand, but my hands were trembling slightly, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Then, I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper, like the sound of someone breathing just behind me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was so faint, I thought I might be imagining it. But then it came again, clearer this time, a soft exhale of breath, too close for comfort. Slowly, I turned around, the flashlight beam sweeping across the room. There was nothing there, just the dim outlines of the old equipment and the shadows they cast. But the feeling of being watched intensified, and the room seemed to grow colder by the second. I decided to finish up as quickly as possible, my nerves frayed. I was almost done when the lights flickered, the fluorescent bulbs buzzing loudly before plunging the room into darkness. My heart skipped a beat, and I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness but offering little comfort. That's when I saw it, a shadowy figure standing in the far corner of the room, just at the edge of the flashlight's reach. It was barely more than a silhouette, but it was unmistakably human, its outline faintly visible in the dim light. The figure was standing unnaturally still, watching me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I blinked, and the figure was gone, as if it had never been there. I wanted to believe I was seeing things, that it was just a trick of the light, but the fear that gripped me was too real. I didn't want to stay in that room any longer. I grabbed the inventory list and the few items I had sorted, and hurried out of the room, my pulse racing. As I stepped into the hallway, I closed the door behind me, but the cold air seemed to follow me, lingering like a bad dream. I didn't tell anyone what I saw that night. I didn't want to sound crazy, and part of me wanted to convince myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But the next day, when I returned to the 3rd floor to finish the inventory, the door to room 319 was ajar, even though I was certain I had locked it. I peeked inside, and everything was just as I'd left it, except for one thing. An old hospital bed, which had been pushed against the wall the night before, was now in the center of the room, its sheets rumpled as if someone had just climbed out of it. I left the room without touching anything else and refused to go back up there alone again. I don't know what happened in room 319, or what presence lingers there, but I'm certain that whatever it is, it doesn't want to be disturbed. And I have no intention of ever going back to find out. I'd been working at St. Andrew's Hospital for nearly 6 years when the incident happened. It's a small, aging facility tucked away in a quiet part of town, mostly dealing with routine cases, broken bones, elderly care, the occasional emergency. But there was one ward we all knew to avoid after dark. The 5th floor East Wing was different. It had been closed for years, officially due to structural issues, but everyone knew it was because of what had happened there. Rumors spread among the staff, stories of a botched surgery, a patient who had died unexpectedly, or a nurse who had committed suicide. No one knew the full truth, but the ward had a reputation. I was never one to believe in ghost stories, and I prided myself on being rational, grounded. But something about that ward always made my skin crawl. It was the silence. Even during the day, the entire floor was unnaturally quiet. The usual hum of machinery, the distant chatter of patients, the footsteps in the hallway, all absent. One night, I was working the late shift, covering for a colleague. The hospital was eerily quiet, as it often was at that hour. Around 2 a.m., I got a call from a nurse on the 4th floor. She was panicked, her voice shaky. "There's someone walking around upstairs, in the East Wing." I frowned. "That's impossible. No one's up there." "I know. But I can hear it. Footsteps, right above me." I assured her I'd check it out, though I wasn't thrilled at the idea. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the stairwell. As I climbed to the 5th floor, my footsteps echoed, the sound bouncing off the cold, empty walls. When I reached the East Wing, the door was locked, just as it should be. But as I approached, I heard it, a faint creaking, like the sound of someone slowly pacing back and forth. I unlocked the door, my heart pounding, and stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with dust and disuse. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from my flashlight, casting long, unsettling shadows. The sound had stopped, but the oppressive silence was worse. I walked down the hall, peering into the abandoned rooms. Old hospital beds stood like forgotten sentinels, their sheets yellowed with age. The air felt colder here, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. I reached the end of the hall, where the sound had been coming from, and found the room. The door was slightly ajar. Pushing it open, I shone my flashlight inside. The room was empty, just like the others, but something felt off. The air was heavier, more suffocating. As I turned to leave, I heard it again, footsteps, slow and deliberate, but this time, they were right behind me. I spun around, the flashlight beam slicing through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just an empty hallway stretching back into the void. My breath quickened. I started to back out of the room, keeping the light ahead of me. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, as if something unseen was lurking just beyond the edges of the light. I reached the door and shut it behind me, but as I did, the footsteps started again, this time louder, more insistent. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I bolted down the hallway, the sound of footsteps chasing me, growing faster and faster. When I reached the stairwell, I slammed the door shut and ran down the stairs, my heart racing. I didn't stop until I was back in the brightly lit, bustling part of the hospital. I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost because the nurse who had called me looked at me with wide eyes. "Did you see anyone?" she asked, her voice trembling. I shook my head. "No, but something's up there." We both decided not to report the incident. What could we say? That we heard footsteps in a locked, abandoned wing? No one would believe us, and honestly, I didn't want to think about it anymore. For the rest of my shift, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me down from that ward. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see a shadow lurking in the corner of my eye. When my shift finally ended, I practically ran out of the hospital, the cold night air a welcome relief. I've worked a lot of late shifts since then, but I've never gone back to that ward. No one else has reported anything unusual, but the story has spread, becoming just another part of the hospital's lore. But I know what I heard. I know what I felt. St. Andrew's is just a hospital, a place of healing and care, but there's something on that 5th floor, something that doesn't belong. And whatever it is, it's still there, waiting in the silence.